Story begins with three guys posing as Frank Abagnale Jr. Appear on a game show and say that they impersonated numerous professions before being exposed. Meanwhile, FBI agent Joe Shape visits Frank Abagnale Jr. in a maximum security jail. Frank Abagnale Jr. looks ill and miserable in a gloomy jail cell. FBI agent Joe Shea arrives and remarks on the poor circumstances. Joe says Frank will be extradited and suffer a hefty jail term despite his pleas for aid. Frank becomes ill and coughs incessantly. Joe panics and calls for aid. Frank is hauled out of his cage, and Joe worries he's stopped breathing. Frank Abagnale Jr. begs for aid in jail as his health declines. He will be extradited and imprisoned for a long time. Frank escapes the hospital but is arrested at gunpoint. He grins at Joe Shea, wanting to go home. Frank Sr. is recognized by the New Rochelle Rotary Club in a banquet room. Frank wears his outfit at Monroe High. He gets strange glances from students. Frank Jr.'s parents learn he's been posing as a substitute teacher in the principal's office. They protect Frank and oppose suspension. Frank is then asked to purchase prom drinks by cheerleaders. Frank finds his mother with another guy at home and confronts her about smoking. Frank's father says he is free from charges after defeating the U.S. government. Frank wants to return home and start anew. They consider reclaiming their belongings and starting again. Other guests approach Frank and his father in a tavern. A fight with Frank's father sends them away. Frank must decide which parent to live with following their divorce in court. Banks reject Frank's check-cashing attempt. He asks Ashley, the teller, to cash it, but she offers to lend him money. Frank ditches the bank. He observes a pilot tip a hotel doorman outside with flight attendants. Frank sets out to become an airline pilot. He attempts to obtain a new uniform, pay a check, and find housing. Frank stays optimistic despite setbacks. Police investigators approach Frank's father outside his business. Frank is accused of running away and overdrawing a checking account. Frank's father supports him, acknowledging his Vietnam service. Detectives apologize and depart. Banks reject Frank's check-cashing attempt. A pilot and flight attendants outside the bank inspire him to become an airline pilot. He works for his aim. FBI agents Joe Shea, Amdersky, and Fox discuss their covert work while driving. Joe asks Amdersky why he switched to bank fraud after his amusing narrative. Amdersky says he was demoted for field mistakes. Fox says he has never worked in the field when Joe asks whether he screwed up and was penalized. Joe informs the hotel owner about a visitor who has been making bounced checks. Joe is interested by the guest's recent check, even if the hotel owner endorses them. He tells Amdersky and Fox to remain at the hotel while he investigates. While walking around the hotel, Joe encounters flight attendants at the pool. Frank, posing as Secret Service, interrupts FBI agent Joe Shea's hotel room investigation. Joe immediately suspects Frank but releases him. Frank phones Joe later to discuss their meeting. After Frank reveals his background to Brenda, they prepare to flee. Frank is surprised by police vehicles and policemen outside Brenda's parents' home. FBI agent Joe Shea offers Brenda to protect Frank if she exposes his whereabouts. Frank forged a passport and birth certificate to escape. He interviews university stewardesses as a pilot. Meanwhile, FBI agent Joe Shea and police prepare to arrest him at Miami International Airport. Frank interviews potential university stewardesses as a pilot to escape arrest. Meanwhile, Joe Shea goes to the airport to find Frank after receiving a tip. Frank, acting as a pilot, gets captured by Joe Shea at Miami International Airport but is an innocent youngster paid to wear the outfit. Joe gets college girl photos and a Liverpool postcard. Frank spends his birthday with relatives in France. The printing press amazes him, and Monique's father explains it. Frank gets infatuated with the machine and operates it alone. He produces hundreds of flawless blue and white Pan Am checks. FBI agent Joe Shea receives a tip on Frank's whereabouts and discovers he has been hiding for months. The FBI heads to Paris to apprehend him. Frank. The French condemn Frank to 2 years in jail. He flies with Joe Shea, who tells him his father committed suicide. Frank panics and runs to the restroom. Frantic about his father's suicide, Frank exits the aircraft toilet and sprints across the runway. Joe Shea arrests him. He meets his mother in a church, where she tells him about his father. Frank confronts his mother and flees, but FBI officers catch him outside the church. A recommendation for seclusion follows his 18-year jail term. Frank sits across from Joe Shea in a prison visitor's room. After an uneasy talk, Joe shows Frank a fake check and describes tracing a counterfeiter. Frank says it's an inside job. Director Marsh and Joe tour the jail. Frank sits across from Joe and Director Marsh in an interrogation room. Joe presents a fake check to Frank for advice. Frank shows the check's weaknesses, proving it's phony. Director Marsh gives Frank a position in the FBI's fraud and counterfeiting squad to complete his term. Frank hesitates and asks why they can't leave him after capturing him. Frank joins the FBI and begins work in the Dallas FBI facility.